Hello, everybody. I'm going to get started for those of us that are here, and thank you very much for joining us at 2 p.m. on the dot. Most of you already know that ISSUP is an organisation which is here to represent the workforce, to build networks within that workforce, to share information, increase knowledge, and we do this through our digital provision, which is our website, our social media, and our email communications. And then we also have national chapters where we deliver our mission on the ground in country. Plus, we have regular events that are either on a global or regional scale where people can come and learn, meet others from the field, and also there are training opportunities. So today, this is very exciting because we are starting our expert days, and this is the first in a series of online, a variety of formats that will be taking place online. We are kicking off today with our expert, Ken Winters, who's going to talk to us about the adolescent brain. And then we'll be continuing to have one of these expert sessions every month. So I'm not going to spend too long talking to you about ISSUP. You all know the organisation and can get in touch with us if you ever want to communicate. But just to let you know that during the actual presentation, you can send questions which will then be taken at the very end, and we will go through those, and a number of those questions will be posed to Ken. So to tell you a little bit about our presenter today, Ken Winters is a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute and an adjunct faculty in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. He retired from the Department of Psychiatry at that university, where he founded and directed at the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research. So he is an expert, he is a friend of ISSUP, and we are truly privileged to have Ken presenting for us today. So I'll hand over to you now, Ken. Thank you very much.
Joanna, thank you. Hello, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity. Great to have you aboard. My thanks to ISSUP for doing a great job in organizing this. You'll see my email on the first slide here, and feel free to send me comments, questions, access to resources after this webinar. I go through some of these slides fairly fast. I'm trying to cover a lot of material. And so you also will have an opportunity for the full slide deck if you contact ISSUP afterwards. I do not have any professional disclosures to report. Before I begin the heart of the talk, I want to point you to a few resources. National Academies Press recently published The Promise of Adolescence, a free document. You can download the PDF there. You see the website. This is an excellent overview of the latest research on adolescence, including brain development. UNICEF has an interesting website called The Adolescent Brain, a Second Window of Opportunity. Several resources at this website, and you can download the full document. They talk about ages 9 to 14 as the second window of opportunity, the first window being birth to age 3. And of course, there's a lot of development and things to talk about with this second window time period. An interesting podcast series from Harvard Center on Developing Child. The podcast series is called The Brain Architects. I'm quoting from their website. Learn the science behind how brains are built and what it means how to build a strong brain. Very excellent website. In addition to this series, they have a lot of research summarized for a wide range of professionals about child and adolescent development. If you Googled TED Talks for brain development, you would get several options. This is the one I like the best. Sarah Jane Blakemore has about a 20-minute TED Talk called The Mysterious Workings of the Adolescent Brain. An excellent overview of recent science for professionals and parents and teenagers. She does a great job of taking this complex topic and bringing it home for non-scientists. A couple more resources. One is a publication that does an interesting job of linking what we know about adolescent brain development and how it could be used in treatment programs or in counseling. And so I do some of that today, but this article expands on many things I'm going to talk about. And then 3 recent publications. These are all books. Each of them cost a little bit. Probably Amazon Books would show you prices maybe as low as $10 for some of these. A motivational interviewing book. Motivational interviewing is a great approach for the adolescent brain. The second one in the middle there, a whole book on the use of brief interventions for teenagers. And the third, a recent clinical manual that covers more than just substance use disorders, but also many of the co-occurring disorders. I'm going to show you a quiz, and we'll come back to this quiz at the end. So maybe you will be thinking about answers along the way. 3 questions. One is, there are several health indices suggesting that teenagers take less risk than in years past. Is that true or false? Second one, what lifestyle choices during adolescence promote good brain development? The third, it's a multiple choice. Which is more harmful to the adolescent developing brain? Chronic heavy use of marijuana or chronic heavy drinking? We'll return to those soon. 4 big topics for today. I'm going to provide a bit of an overview on brain development, then delving a little bit more deeply into this topic by discussing the intersection of brain development, drug use, mental health, and the role of early experiences. Then the implications of all this for youth-serving workers, and then a summary. A reminder that I'm talking about science that's very complicated, and it's very difficult to make direct links between brain development and human behavior. There are a lot of sources of error, bias, of weaknesses in studies. I have 5 of them here, all the way from there can be confirmation bias among scientists and the standard stuff, it's small sample sizes, perhaps not enough time has passed to look at outcomes, and also a reminder that making direct links between brain functions and structures and human behavior is problematic. So you have to be careful about not over-interpreting data looking at that role of neuroscience and behavior. One more introductory note. My spotlight on brain development and its impact on adolescent behavior and health does not diminish the impact of environment and social determinants on behavior. I'm going to be angling a lot of this on the biology and the neuroscience, but this doesn't mean that, of course, the social determinants and environments are not important. They, of course, are. I will be integrating some of that throughout the talk, but keep in mind that you're only really seeing today, one portion of the whole picture of how we think about the causes of health and the course of health as a young person ages into adulthood. I thought I'd give you the main points of my talk right up front, give you a preview of what you're going to be getting over the next several minutes. Major point number 1, the maturation of the adolescent brain likely contributes to behaviors that are characteristic of this developmental period. So many things we see among adolescents can be looked at as perhaps contributed by brain development. This maturation informs our understanding of risk for substance use disorders and other behavioral disorders. We'll be looking at that literature. And then an important part, youth-serving workers and educators can leverage this science when working with adolescents and parents. To highlight that, I'm going to talk later 6 ways you can use this information in your work, whether you're a teacher, prevention specialist, or a treatment provider. These are the 6. To give you a preview, I'm going to discuss later how important it is to teach young people about brain development and the implications it has on their life at that time. I'll be emphasizing the importance of using evidence-based prevention programs. We'll review some ways to get some of those sources and how you can learn the keys to effective principle. 2 treatment notions I'm going to emphasize. One is the principle that the earlier the treatment, the better for people of all ages, particularly for young people. I want to emphasize in the treatment arena also that there are many evidence-based treatment principles and strategies, and many good summaries of those. And I want to talk about the importance of educating young people about 2 what I'm calling more emerging substance use health threats, that is cannabis and vaping. So I call it increasing the cannabis and vaping IQ of adolescents. And the last will be discussing how you can use this information when you're teaching or talking or working with parents. And I'll review how I use the word parent as a guide to help reinforce some of the basic principles we're talking about and making it part of parenting practices. Topic number 1, overview of adolescent brain development. There's 2 main themes that have come out of this line of research. One theme is that brain maturation continues through adolescence up until about approximately age 25. So prior to this rigorous neuroscience work, experts thought brain development was pretty much done by the time a teenager started adolescence. But no, there's still, as UNICEF reminds us, it's still a second period of brain development, an important period. The other principle is that this maturation process doesn't occur equally across all regions of the brain. It occurs in a way that you could make a case, metaphorically, that the brakes systems of the brain are maturing later, but the accelerator or the pedal systems of the brain are maturing faster. So you have this differential maturation process going on. And so in some ways, you have parts of the brain competing against each other. And because one is maturing faster, that would be the accelerator regions, they tend to dominate or can win out, I call it, when these 2 regions are weighing in when it comes time to making decisions, or showing emotion, or having perceptions of things, or processing information. More on this differential maturation. This is a slide that shows a synthesis of brain imaging data from a large group of young people. And what was done is they synthesized the data to represent how the maturation occurs from ages 5 to 20. As things are getting blue on this slide, that's neuromaturation occurring. 2 principles basically underlying this neuromaturation. One's called synaptic pruning, the other one called myelination. But the important thing is you're seeing generally the brain mature, and the parts that are getting blue quite quickly there, they would be the limbic regions that have to do with emotion and motivation primarily, reward processing, very important in decision making. And the portions getting blue later are more frontal of the brain, prefrontal cortex and associated regions. Those regions have a lot to do with also decision making, heavy lifting there of delaying gratification, showing impulse control, and making complex decisions. So one metaphor I have is that the brain for a teenager is still a bit on training wheels. And so you could make a case that the way the brain is functioning and contributing to human behavior is not the same way it will contribute to human behavior when the youngster reaches adulthood. You could say it's not functioning at full capacity or optimally, because you're not getting all regions of the brain to equally contribute to behavior and health decisions, for example. But one other sidebar about this age 25, keep in mind, a lot of maturation has already been complete for most individuals in this age group by around age 18 to 20. But there is still maturation occurring up until about age 25. Another caveat, keep in mind that much of this data is based on westernized samples. And so we don't know a lot about how much this trajectory is different in non-westernized young people. Young people that do not have the advantages of westernized culture. Less nutrition, for example. They may be experiencing extreme stress and adverse conditions. These are things getting studied, but we don't know yet about the big differences that are likely to be there when we are comparing adolescents raised in perhaps so-called more ideal conditions versus those living and being raised in less ideal conditions. One way to look at this brain development science is to try to think about adolescent behavior. So we reviewed what developmental psychologists were saying about the implications of this science and how it might inform the ways we think about adolescent behavior. So I have 8 implications on this list. They're grouped into 3 categories. And if you read the list, basically what we're saying here is many things that we see tend to be perhaps common among adolescents, things that give us some problems in dealing with teenagers, whether it's the classroom or at home, can be tied to the possibility that it's related to brain development. So among these, we see a lot of things that occur still throughout life. And it's not that it's just unique to adolescence. For example, all the preferences I have up here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, well, many of us have preference for those things throughout life, but the notion is that this might have a more predominance in the teenager's behavior, and that they take these things with more salience, and it might direct decisions they make more so than as adults, where we might balance other aspects a little bit better. One of them I think about that's relevant here is novelty. We all like novelty, but the notion is that during adolescence, that novelty might really be a great and a big pull for a teenager when they're making decisions, where as adults, we might weigh many other things before we go towards something that's novel. Now I've colored in red among these 8 what might be contributors to risk-taking that is unhealthy or unwise. High excitement for rewarding activities with peers that trigger high intensity, novelty seeking, less than optimal control of emotions and less than optimal consideration of negative consequences, and a greater tendency to be overly attentive to social information and a tendency to take risks. All of these could contribute to teenagers making decisions that at the moment of making that decision, it turns out to be unwise and unhealthy. On the other hand, let's not look at all of this as risks. So I've colored in green these implications of brain development that might actually be assets, or they might promote health and personal growth. Preferences for all these 4 things I've noted, they really could be things that lead a teenager to do something exciting and pro-social, and to try out new things that really can promote personal growth. And I've even colored in green taking risks, because surely there are risks that are taken that can lead to great outcomes. In fact, if you're if you're too shy about taking risks, any risk in life, you may actually minimize the opportunities and not be all that you can be. A little bit more about risk taking, because it's an important theme in the developmental psychology literature. The latest science, when we think about risk taking in teenagers, suggests that teens are actually pretty good at judging the risk of a given situation or of their behavior. They don't really show a cognitive deficit in that way. But what turns out to be happening, it looks like, is that they make decisions that lead to perhaps unhealthy and unwise risk because they are heavily persuaded and pulled in by emotional and contextual factors. And often this can be the influence of other peers. So the excitement of being with friends that can energize and can lead the emotionality to get the best of him or her can lead to some problematic risk. This has been shown in a driving simulation study, so that you can show people's risk driving behavior in a simulated contest by putting them in these driving simulated labs. There's a lot of bars here. The main point of the study done was that when you compared adolescents, young adults, and adults on driving ability, the three age groups, even though they're quite different in driving history and in theory driving experience, they all were pretty similar in the amount of risk they took or the number of simulated crashes that occurred when they were just alone by him or herself in the simulated car. But when they had the second condition offered and everyone brought a friend to sit next to them in the simulated task, one group showed a worsening of their driving ability, and that was the youngest group, the adolescents. The other two age groups were able to maintain their relative rate of risk and simulated crashes when they had someone with them. But it was the adolescent group that showed this peer effect, and in the negative way. They were basically becoming a poorer driver when they had a peer with them. All right, let's take some of these principles and talk about drug use, mental health, and the role of early experiences. I'll first tackle the topic of brain development and substance use. Main question asked by the research literature, are adolescents more susceptible than adults to drugs? Several lines of evidence have been looked at. It's both animal and human models. Keep in mind that the human data is less rigorous because, of course, you can't give underage individuals substances in the laboratory and measure their effects. So that's why animal models are used. Often mice or rat studies have been employed by researchers. So we'll look at two types of data. And I'm trying to compare the susceptibility of these two age groups, adolescents and adults. All humans to some degree are susceptible to the effects of drugs, but the question is the adolescent with that developing brain more susceptible or not? So one line of evidence comes from general epidemiology research, which shows a pattern of drug use that suggests the teen years is the most susceptible period of time. If you look at least most westernized countries that have data on drug use across the lifespan, you see that drug use typically starts early teen years, 11, 12, 13, and peaks during those teen years and does not tend to level off until the end of adolescence or young adulthood, right around 25. Actually, in the United States, that's an interesting finding. You get to see the tendency to drop one's drug use, level of drug use, intensity of drug use, right around age 25. So teen years are relatively susceptible. Well, does that use pattern lead to later risk for addiction? this slide shows a comparison of when individuals started using alcohol and marijuana, and then their risk of having a later substance use disorder or dependence on either alcohol or marijuana. And you can see the bars are much higher when age of starting to use was much younger. It's quite dramatic for both alcohol and marijuana, a little bit more dramatic for alcohol. So for example, the far left set of bars, I'll just highlight that, for individuals who started using alcohol before age 13. Now this isn't just casual use, this would mean relatively heavy use. The probability of later having an alcohol use disorder throughout their life, at least once meeting criteria, was almost 50%. For marijuana, that's around 18, 17%. You can see how that probability of a lifetime problem or later addiction drops significantly if you can wait till 21 or older to start using a substance. Other drugs that have been mapped out with this kind of intersection of starting use and later addiction show the same pattern. So a little focus on the two drugs, alcohol and first and then marijuana. Are adolescents more susceptible to alcohol than adults? Two mice studies, there's sets of mice studies have been looked at. One shows that the adolescent mice are less sensitive to the sedative and motor impairment effects of intoxication than adults who are intoxicated, that is adult mice. And one of the studies showed the ability for intoxicated mice to swim. And it turns out the adolescent mice that were intoxicated did a better job of the swimming than the adult mice that were intoxicated. So the argument was that actually when you just look at acute effects, you get less of an impact of alcohol on the adolescent than on the adult. One more set of studies showed how adolescent mice are more sensitive, though, to the social disinhibition effects of alcohol. When drinking tends, for most of us, to give a social disinhibition effect, and when they compared social behavior of intoxicated adolescent mice and intoxicated adult mice, you had more social behavior shown in the adolescent mice than in the adult mice. So the combination of these two, less sensitive to the acute negative effects, but more sensitive to the acute positive effects, that's a bad recipe. And so the belief is that this animal literature might be generalizable to adolescents. And it might explain why heavy drinking occurs. The negative effects of that are not being felt by the teenager, so it emboldens him or her to keep on drinking. And of course, they're enjoying the social effects of that, and that just further promotes binge drinking and doing it frequently. One neurological study about the effects of binge drinking was recently reported by Ruan and his colleagues. They looked at teenagers ages 14, 16, and 19, and they measured binge drinking patterns and then looked at neuroimaging data. And they found that those teenagers that had the most prominent or the heaviest binge drinking pattern showed the biggest disruption in the maturation of frontal connectivity. Now, it was a small sample, have to caution interpretation of these data, but by disrupting frontal connectivity, remember now that's the prefrontal cortex region, very important for decision making, ability to delay gratification. And it would suggest that by disrupting that frontal connectivity, that is impairing one's ability to delay gratification. They further confirmed it with their personality data that showed longitudinally a slower developmental improvement of impulse control in the group that had the heaviest binge drinking. one example of trying to connect substance use behavior, brain development, and possible health effects. The marijuana topic is also getting a lot of attention among scientists. It makes sense to look at the effects of marijuana on adolescent brain development. This slide, courtesy of NIDA, just shows you that we have a lot of cannabinoid receptors across multiple regions of the brain. So when we use cannabis, the THC binds to these receptor sites and can impact or have an effect on multiple aspects of human behavior. On the left, I've got a summary of them: memory, motivation, appetite, reproduction, movement, pain regulation. Also, these cannabinoid receptors are believed to be important in brain development. And so there's a concern that by overactivating them, it is disrupting the brain development process, not just having an impact on your memory short-term or your short-term appetite, but maybe having a longer-term impact on brain development. I'm pointing you to a review in 2014 of the adverse health effects of chronic cannabis use. So Nora Volkow, director of NIDA, and her colleagues reviewed the literature that was available back then and summarized what looked to be the most relevant health impacts based on research, and then categorize them in terms of low, medium, and high confidence. Now, level of confidence meant the extent to which we can say that chronic marijuana use contributes to that particular ailment or disorder or health impact. So you can see one had the low confidence, and then there were several that had medium and high level confidence. So there were 8 of them across the board. In the next slide, I have colored in green the impacts that the authors felt that there was enough data to indicate that if early use of marijuana occurred, you would even get a more pronounced negative health effect. In other words, the data suggests that with early onset or adolescent onset cannabis use that continues chronically, you get even a more pronounced impact in terms of altered brain development, increased risk for chronic psychosis, increased risk for addiction, and increased risk for diminished life satisfaction and achievement. So 4 out of the 8, back with data available back then, showed a link between early onset use and even more pronounced health impact. And as the authors note, this could be mediated by the fact that the marijuana use is having an impact on the brain maturation process. One other look at marijuana and health impacts: the Dunedin study out of New Zealand got a lot of attention early 2012 because of the link between marijuana use and possible IQ. Briefly, the major years of assessment that are relevant for this discussion of this sample of about 1,000 New Zealanders at age 13, 18, 21, 32, and 38, there were assessments. At age 13, which is, I'm putting pre-initiation, that means before substance use was initiated by virtually all of the subjects. And then at age 38, there were IQ tests given, age-appropriate IQ tests. So you had these 2 IQ points for everyone, but then starting at the assessment points of 18, 21, 32, and 38, the subjects were asked about their substance use histories. At age 18, I put a box around it because not only were they asked, are they currently using, but they were asked at what age did they first start to use. So the authors then looked at the intersection of whether there was heavy use or not of marijuana, and how early in life did the marijuana use start, if there was marijuana use, and then was there a change in IQ. And these data are mapped out on this somewhat complicated slide. I apologize, it's a little hard to talk about this complex topic with one slide, but I give NIDA credit for coming up with something that's pretty understandable, but I put in red in the box to the far right, the main conclusion that is relevant for our discussion. For individuals in the sample that A, started using their marijuana before age 18, and B, they were chronic heavy users throughout adulthood, they had on average an 8 IQ point drop. The other groups that started early onset, adolescent onset that is, they had also some drop in IQ, but not statistically significant. And the good news was if you waited till after age 18 and you weren't a heavy user, you had virtually no change in IQ. But keep in mind, all studies have caveats and potential weaknesses, and small sample sizes are a downer on this study. And I put the numbers in atop of the bars, and below you can see by the red arrow where I also have the numbers repeated. So larger, more rigorous studies are needed to see if this is a reliable finding or not, but it's surely provocative. So why might adolescents be more susceptible, and how much is perhaps brain development implicated? Briefly, there are 3 reasons we could point to. One is there could just be the fact that brain development may contribute to certain tendencies in the adolescent years, normal, healthy brain development. Well, that just may contribute to curiosity to use drugs and to continue using. So I'm putting up again the slide that had these potential 8 implications of brain development, and I colored 7 out of 8. And all of them, if you look at each, you might say, okay, that could maybe contribute to a little higher risk of curiosity to use, continuing to use, and not feeling like there's negative consequences. There's also a concern that the way the brain is developing during the teen years, that it might even be more susceptible to what has been called the hijacking that can occur when somebody uses drugs chronically to one's brain reward pathway. As you may know, drugs do trigger the brain's pleasure centers. There's a neurological basis for addiction, and if this reward pathway is overactivated repeatedly, this can contribute to addiction. Well, one concern is that the adolescent pleasure centers, these reward regions in the brain, may be more sensitive to the acute effects of drugs than pleasure centers in the adult brain. So if dopamine activity, which is the main neurotransmitter in the reward pathway region that is sensitive to drugs, if that is more so-called robust during adolescence compared to adults, that might mean as a teenager, when you're taking drug, you might have greater sensitivity to the initial drug effects. You might have greater motivation to continue to use, and you might have greater difficulty in reducing your use, all because just the normal brain development that's going on is unfortunately a susceptibility factor for drug risk and drug use. A third issue might be that it could create a biological priming or a so-called biological gateway effect when you use substance early in life. So it could lead to structural and processing changes in the brain that might mean you're just more susceptible to addiction, particularly if you then restart your use later in life. This has been done with mice with nicotine. 2 groups of adolescent mice were entered into a study. One group of the adolescent mice were given nicotine during adolescence. The other group was not. And then they stopped introducing nicotine to that one group. And then they waited till the adolescent mice grew up, became so-called adult mice. And then they offered them the voluntary opportunity to self-administer nicotine. So both adult mice are given this opportunity And sure enough, the adolescent mice had, the ones that were exposed during adolescence, they had much more interest in self-administering nicotine. So the concern was that sort of they had been primed, and it could be neurologically, to be more interested in nicotine. If you want to read more about this, there's a great study by Wren that looks at the literature on this and shows that it looks like long-term molecular, biochemical, and functional changes in the brain can occur with early exposure to nicotine and other substances. All right, briefly, let's move to brain development and behavioral disorders. Alterations in neurodevelopment have been linked to several adolescent onset mental and behavioral disorders. I have a list here. Many adult behavioral disorders have their onset during adolescence, and now the science that has been looking at this is suggesting that there could be some neurological reasons for it. The brain maturation process may not be unfolding in a normal way among many individuals who then show these symptoms during adolescence, and many of them develop adult versions of it. This slide reminds us that many disorders do onset during adolescence. The numbers above each of the bars is the age at which 50% of people have already onsetted with the relevant disorder, and 50% would get the disorder after that age. But it does reflect how many disorders have a very early onset. Any impulse control disorder box that represents things like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. And there is a concern about the link between marijuana and behavioral disorders. Summary of the literature by Miller showed that if you look at the 5 disorders for which there's the most data linking cannabis use and mental disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, anxiety, depressive disorders, and risk of suicide, she concluded, and I put yellow boxes around them, 3 of the disorders have the greater risk when cannabis use begins during adolescence. Greater risk when cannabis use onsetted during adolescence for schizophrenia, bipolar, and risk of suicide. And of course, the concern is that that early use is deleteriously impacting brain development. I'm going to skip this slide. It just kind of shows the same story about risk of early cannabis use and schizophrenia. Keep in mind, I make a case this might be altering brain development, but it also just could be a marker for underlying genetic risk and not causing or altering the brain maturation process. But these kinds of things are difficult to tease out. What's the direction of the cause and effect? It could be bidirectional and it could be interactive. More rigorous longitudinal studies are going to be needed. So the last big intersection point, I want to mention how environment is important. A great quote from Anderson: exposure to both positive and negative elements before adolescence can imprint on the final adult topography in a manner that differs from exposure to the same elements after adolescence. It's important that both positive and negative elements can make a big impact, more so during adolescence than adults. The interaction, so 2 important quotes from Harvard. The interaction between genetic predispositions and sustained stress-inducing experiences early in life can lay an unstable foundation for mental health that endures well into the adult years. We know that, but we also know that there are rays of hope, because as Harvard reminds us, some individuals demonstrate remarkable capacities to overcome the severe challenges of early, persistent maltreatment, trauma, and emotional harm. Most potential mental health problems will not become mental health problems if we respond to them early. And I encourage you to go to Center on Developing Child website, and you get great reviews and examples of how brain development in positive ways can lead to positive trajectories. Interesting study. I'll give you one on the positive side and one on the negative. Luby looked at the extent to which parental support can have an impact on brain development. And her focus was on hippocampus volume. Hippocampus is an important part of the brain that's associated with memory and learning. And she found that for youngsters that had more parental support, they had or showed more hippocampus volume. Now, more hippocampus volume is related to and was shown to be related to better memory in the youth and better emotional regulation. So better memory is likely going to mean better downstream learning, and improved or stronger emotional regulation surely could mean better coping strategies. We know that adverse child experiences can be very toxic and can lead to a host of problems. I'm going to show you one example, and this was going to go to this one. Callaghan's study looked at children who were deprived of parents early in life. They were orphans compared to children with parents. You can imagine the orphan children were not getting as much parental contact and could surely be viewed as living in a more stressful environment. And those that were deprived of parents, they showed physical symptoms. And a key one was the pattern of gut microbiomes were linked to both having more current and future anxiety, and also had shown more sensitivity to emotional faces. And the last point is important because it was thought that by having overreaction to emotional faces, this could lead to greater anxiety, more difficulty dealing with stress, and downstream coping impairments. Okay, implications for you in working with young people and in the classroom. I've got 6 principles. One of them, kick off with the important notion of directly teaching young people about brain development and its importance for health and well-being. Talking to teenagers about how brain development can have all these implications, and having them discuss how these can be good implications and maybe not so good, and how you don't want to have some of these get the best of one that can be negative and lead to problems, but how they can also be harnessed for health and well-being. One way I do this is organizing brain development around good decision making. 3 principles I talk to teenagers about. What kind of risk can actually promote personal growth? What is good risk? The importance of having on second thought skills. This would be, around the notion of making sure you don't, let gratification impulses get the best of you, and kick in second thought strategies and skills, which make you pause and think and perhaps come up with a little bit better decision than if you just went with your gut reaction. And then the whole issue of skills to avoid peer pressure that might lead you to engage in delinquency or decisions and behaviors that later you will regret.
Hi, Ken.
Yes.
Hi, we have about 5 minutes left.
Excellent, thank you. We're doing quite well. If you are interested in a resource that you can use to teach young people about brain development, I have a free resource for you. Send me an email. You'll get a few files. Some of the things would be what you would print out for youngsters, and some of it is just instructions for you, as well as a PowerPoint file that you can use to show to young people. It's intended for roughly the 12 to 18 age group. There's my email if you'd like this resource. I want to speak to the prevention specialist by reminding you that there are now several resource and research documents that tell us keys to effective prevention. NIDA, Cochrane, and ISSUP all has resources. You see the websites there. I think you'll find all of them do synthesize around the importance of age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate resources, prevention content, as well as content that improves skills, life skills. 2 treatment principles. Earlier, the treatment, the better. It's perhaps a very straightforward principle that you all appreciate. The slide to the right, the blue line is the best line. That just shows that the sooner people got treatment from the first time they had using substances to getting treatment, the quicker they achieved long-term, or let's call it a high-quality abstinence. But if you waited a long time between the time you had problems with substance and then got treatment, your probability of getting good recovery was much further downstream. And there are many publications that can point you to evidence-based treatment. I've got underneath here 2 articles, and then in red, the NIDA report. If you Google NIDA Principles of Adolescent Substance Use Disorder Treatment or Principles of Adolescent Treatment, you will see the free document. All of these reports converge on the advantages of using motivational enhancement therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and family therapy. 2 more implications of this science. As I mentioned, I think it's helpful to teach teenagers about I call it the newest threats of cannabis and vaping. 2 sources I've provided here if you want to turn them into what I call them exercises and quizzes for your young people that you're working with in the classroom or in prevention and treatment programs. Teenagers have many myths about cannabis these days, as well as vaping, but they are 2 ways of using and a drug of using that has serious health consequences. And I think there's a lot of misinformation that is going around by many age groups, but unfortunately, I think youth are endorsing way too many myths about cannabis and vaping. And so directly addressing them and discussing these with young people, I think, is very helpful. And then my final implication point is how you can use this science to teach parents to do a better job of parenting. So I take the letters of parent and I turn each letter into a principle, and I have the parents talk about each of these, whether it's a small group or a large group. But each of them reflect something about either brain development or promoting health and well-being in a young person. Feel free to turn this into a handout or a slide and use this. You can spend almost a full hour talking with parents just organized around these 6 principles, and get them with the last one, that tolerate the oops behaviors. Get the parents to talk about the challenges and perhaps the funny stories they've had about dealing with their teenager who, how did he or she come to do that? Or what was he or she thinking? Most parents have many stories. Some of them are an oops. It's a mistake a teenager will make, and not over disciplining something that might be relatively minor is important. But having parents realize that sometimes the oops behavior can lead to more chronic problems, and those are worthy of much more attention. 3 parent resources I like. I've got them numbered. Number 1 is Mentor International's Drug Prevention for Parents resource. NIDA for Teens is a great, actually, parent resource, even though it could also be used with teenagers. And then drugfree.org has a wealth of parent-based resources. To summarize, hopefully you've appreciated my major point that adolescence is an extended period of transition from reliance on adults to independence, and it involves a significant amount of brain development. And that brain development leads to many normal behaviors, which can include conflicts with parents, desire to be with one's friends, irritability, risk-taking, unfortunately sometimes unhealthy risk-taking, and often you're going to hear proclamations of sheer boredom. I think of brain development in the teen years as a time when reward incentives for a teenager tends to be greater than their realization or their perception of consequences. So perhaps more often than not, they're in a just do it mode, in part because of context, peer pressure, and other influences. But several lines of evidence suggest that adolescence is a vulnerable period when it comes to the effects of drugs, and it's a period linked to the onset of some mental disorders. So, and those two can be intersecting, where drug use may be impacting brain development in a deleterious way that not only leads to risks for addiction, but may lead to increased risk for some mental disorders. But adolescence also is a wonderful time of personal growth and can be shaped in ways that are unique to adolescence. And hopefully you appreciated that you can take this science and employ teen brain friendly and evidence-based prevention and treatment resources. And I mentioned treatment, prevention, and parent-based aspects to this. So before we get into a brief time for Q&A, the answer to the quiz. There are several health indices suggesting that teenagers take less risk than in years past. That would be true. There is some evidence in westernized cultures that there's an increased rate of abstaining from all substances among young people. And in some countries, there are lower rates now of teenage pregnancies and of certain delinquency behaviors. So to some degree, we're finding some great news. What lifestyle choices promote good brain development? Well, hopefully you appreciated the fact no drug use should be on the list, but basic healthy lifestyle choices also are great for brain development. Good diet, enough sleep, exercise, and an active social life. The third one, which is more harmful to the developing brain? It's a good question, whether it's the drinking or the heavy marijuana use. They're both not helpful. They both are probably harmful, but it's not clear which is more harmful. It clearly isn't the case, though, that marijuana is a harmless drug, and that drinking is. And that can be a myth among some people. Okay, thank you. There's my email. Perhaps we have a chance for some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ken. We're now going to open up for about 10 minutes of Q&A. We do have some good questions in the questions box. The first one I'm going to start with is from Ali, who has asked, Ken, are you aware of any studies done in South Asia regarding adolescent brain development? He's asked, as he pointed out, there could be many aspects or issues which could be particularly different from those seen in Western society.
Yep, great question. And that is one I'm going to have to do a little homework on, because I don't have any knowledge about a specific difference in different cultures, including Southeast Asia. But what I'll do is do a little homework, and I will send a response to James and Livia, and they can send around the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question that's come in is, do you think, Ken, that there are any gender differences to be seen in brain development?
Yes, that is pretty rigorous finding. The basic difference is that that whole maturation time is a little faster for girls and boys. I've read from some experts it might be a year to a 2-year difference. So they still show that differential pattern, but they're a year or two ahead of typical boys. You can imagine how certain behavioral differences between the genders that isn't necessarily related to hormonal differences might be accounted for by that maturation pace difference. By the way, it reminds me, hormones, of course, have a big impact on behavior and even brain development. I didn't get into that because it's a very large and important piece of the story. But hormonal changes, of course, are going to have an impact on behavior during the teen years.
And have you seen any differing prevention strategies for different genders? Are there any different approaches that are gender specific?
Well, in some of the life skills components of prevention programs, you've got to deal with some issues that are more relevant to challenges that girls have in the teen years than boys. So I'm always impressed with those programs that are tackling important skill building and decision making, that you make sure there's some gender specificity with that. And it's always relevant to adapt and adjust prevention programs based on your audience. And so you may have a specific gender topics and issues that are relevant for a given classroom or a given school or a given group, and you got to make sure to address them and personalize things accordingly.
Okay, probably have time for one more question. In prevention activities, what amount of time would you normally spend focusing upon brain development within other prevention activities? How much time would you recommend is dedicated to it?
I know that's I hadn't thought of that type of way to intersect brain development with prevention. Let me put it this way. I could see where you'd want to lead off prevention content with brain development science, and then throughout the rest of your prevention curriculum, link it back to where it's relevant, that the brain science principles are important to what you're trying to teach with the core prevention principles. Because in many instances, you could be talking about, okay, we want to promote this kind of skill when you're trying to resist pressure to use drugs. And so you'd review some of the classic skills of verbalizing this or walking away, et cetera, but then you could draw it back to, okay, what are some of the challenges teenagers have in applying these skills, in part because perhaps, in a given context and given brain development, this might add to those challenges.
Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. I'd like to extend thanks from the whole ISSUP team and everybody that's attended to you, Ken, for this fantastically insightful presentation. Thank you very much for being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure that everybody's found it very, very enlightening. For anybody that's joined us late, we're going to make the recording available, and we're also going to be sharing slides of Ken's presentation. So those will be available to view and download from our website. Also, keep an eye on our social media channels, because we'll probably be posting links there. Just some quick details of our next ISSUP Expert Days webinar. The next webinar is going to be on March the 13th at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. It's going to be with Kerry Hopkins-Isles, who's going to be talking about authentic self-care for addiction professionals, and how those of us who work in the field of substance use disorders can look after ourselves and identify healthy and unhealthy traits and maintain boundaries. So I hope you'll all join us again on March the 13th for the next Expert Days webinar. Thanks again to Ken, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you also. Everyone have a great day.